Okay, so now we're going to talk about the current view of public opinion and how political scientists understand this. And let me start off by saying there is an alternative perspective, but I find this one extremely persuasive and it explains a lot of things about public opinion. But as I've mentioned previously in these set of videos, it'll also explain the role of the media and the power or lack thereof of the media. So the memory-based information processing model is based on the idea that there are two kinds of information that we have stored in our heads. Before I begin, let me be clear that I'm not talking about anatomically where information is stored. That's not my field of expertise, but just the general idea that we have some information that's stored in the back of our head and some information that's stored at the top of our head. And the thing that makes those two things unique is that information at the back of our head is hard to access from memory, whereas information at the top of our head is easy to access from memory. And to explain this, I want to tell you the tale of Benjamin Lee. Benjamin Lee was a student when I was at UCLA. He has no idea that he's part of my lectures at all. So Benjamin was a student in one of my classes, and I can tell you a lot about Benjamin. He was a really good student. I remember he used to sit in the class just off to the left, and he sat next to another friend, and after class, he and his friend would frequently come back to my office and we would have extensive discussions about the material covered in class and politics in general. So that's who Benjamin Lee is. So here's where the story begins. I was walking out from parking lot 3 at UCLA, and when you come out from the parking lot at UCLA, immediately to the left is our theaters that were there. So I'm walking out and I see a group of students standing right outside the theater. That wasn't very common. Usually it was empty, there was no one there. And especially at that time of day, it was usually around 10 in the morning. But sure enough, there's a whole group of students there. And as I walk up to start approaching going to my office, I can see in the group of students this one student whose face I recognize, right? And obviously it was Benjamin Lee. And again, as soon as I saw him, I could tell you all that information about him, where he sat in the class. I don't remember what his friend looked like, but I knew they sat together. I knew they came back to my office. I had a genuinely good feeling about seeing this student. I remembered a ton of things about this student, except for one thing. I couldn't remember his name. I just couldn't remember his name. And that's always really embarrassing because I wouldn't have wanted him to think that because I didn't remember his name, I didn't remember him as a student. I did remember him as a student and thought very fondly of him. I don't remember what grade he got in the class, but I'm sure he got a high grade. He was a genuinely nice guy, but I just couldn't remember his name. And I was basically trying to avoid embarrassing him, but I was also trying to avoid embarrassing myself as well, quite frankly. So I hit upon a plan. I decided this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up the pace, the speed at which I'm walking, as if I'm in a hurry. And my plan was that as I'm hurrying on by, there we go, this is me hurrying on by, I'm going to turn to Benjamin and I'm going to go boom, like, hey, good to see you, and then keep going. Because I wanted him to know that I remembered him. I just didn't want him to know that I didn't remember his name. And so that's what I did. I picked up my pace, I looked over, I started to point to him, and he comes and he intercepts me. I was like, damn, that was a great plan, but it didn't work. And we shake hands. He's like, hey, Phil, how's it going? He called me Phil. We're on first name basis. That's typically how my students refer to me. We start talking. How's it going this quarter? What are you teaching this quarter? All this stuff. So we're talking about all kinds of things. But all the time through my head, what's the thing going through my head like over and over and over again? Yeah, what's his name? What's your name? What's your name? I'm just like trying to remember and trying to remember. Now, if somebody had frozen time, let's say God had frozen time right there, and he had handed me a roster of that class and said the student's name is on this list. If I had gone down that list, as soon as I got to Benjamin Lee, I would have been, oh, that's right, that's Benjamin. Thank you so much. Right? Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and presumably God has more important things to do than to help me avoid embarrassing somebody or embarrassing myself. And so I didn't have that opportunity. We start talking, and now I'm sort of reverting back to plan B, and so I say to the student, oh, that's right. He says to me at the end of this discussion, he says, I was wondering if you could write me a letter of recommendation. I'm like, oh my goodness, right? So I'm thinking like, what do I say? How do I deal with this? Since I didn't remember his name. I said, absolutely, I'd be delighted to write you a letter of recommendation. Please do me a favor, send me an email and remind me, and we'll talk about what needs to happen next. Sure enough, he sends me an email later. I see that it's from Benjamin Lee. It's like, oh, that's right, that's his name, and boom, now I remember him. The following week, I'm walking out from parking lot 3 again. I see the group of students sitting there again, and he's sitting there as well, or standing actually. He's standing there as well. And as I walk by, I don't have to speed up my pace any longer. As I walk by, what do you think I said to him? Yeah, I said, hey, Benjamin, right? When I first saw Benjamin, his name was in the back of my head. I couldn't access it. I couldn't access it from memory. But by the time I got his email and saw him the second time, now his name was at the top of my head. It was very easy for me to access his name. This is central to the memory-based information processing model, that we have information at the top of our head and we have information at the back of our head. So with that in mind, this is the process by which people answer survey questions according to the memory-based model, keeping in mind that information from the top of the head is easy to access, so it doesn't take very much cognitive energy. Information from the back of the head is hard to access because it takes more energy to get to it. That if a public opinion poll calls and you answer the phone and agree to be in the survey, and they ask, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? What you're not going to do is search everything you have stored in memory before answering that question, right? Because, quite frankly, it would take too long. Think about it. If you agree to do a poll and they ask you, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? How long do you have before you have to answer that question? Right? At what point does it start to get awkward? It actually turns out, if you think about it, that you have to come up with an answer in like 2 seconds at the most. Sometimes in classes, students will say you have 10 seconds. And so what I'll do is I'll ask that question, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? And then I'll start counting off how long 10 seconds actually is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And by then, students are already laughing because you have to answer before that or they're going to think that you hung up on them. And then after they ask you, do you approve or disapprove the job the president is doing, then they're going to hit you with, do you approve or disapprove the job the president is doing on the economy? Do you approve or disapprove the job the president is doing on foreign policy? Do you approve it? They're just going to bombard you with questions, and you have to come up with answers relatively quickly. So what proponents of the memory-based model say is what individuals don't do is search everything they have stored in memory. It just would take way too long. So what do they do instead? And by the way, not they, this also includes me. This is true for people who don't know a lot about politics. This is true for people with PhDs in political science. That when answering survey questions, what we do is we take a random sample of the attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, and not so much from the back of the head. And based on the sample that we get, we express an opinion. Now, because that's kind of complicated, I'm going to present this in two different forms. One using a picture of Homer Simpson's head, and the other one using a PowerPoint demonstration to get this idea across, but I'll do those in the next videos.